I'm Pete Peterson. I'm the Executive Director of the Davenport Institute for Public Engagement and Civic Leadership at Pepperdine School of Public Policy in Malibu. I teach a class entitled Leadership Through Public Engagement to Masters in Public Policy students, but 90% of the work that I do is outside the classroom, consulting with and training public sector officials in how to do effective, legitimate public engagement. I think the relationships that really ground the work that we do is the fact that we feel that our clients, if you want to call them that, are by and large public sector officials. So we have an advisory council to the Davenport Institute, which is made up of entirely city managers, mayors, regional government officials. And unless and until we can speak to them in terms that they can understand and take back and apply public processes to their communities in which they serve, then we're really not doing anything effective. This is really about embedding public processes as a leadership skill, as opposed to seeing public engagement as its own unique department or way of doing things. And I think that's really been one of the parts that's really resonated with the folks that we work with, again, mostly local government officials, is instead of seeing public engagement as a completely separate thing where they automatically have to hire an independent facilitator or something like that, that there is an opportunity to think about it as, I have a problem to solve, will a public process help me to do that? And I think that's really kept our feet on the ground as it pertains to promoting public engagement. Very good question. I think that most of the work that we consult on comes from one of two main sources. One is that we actually do run an annual public engagement grant program. We've done it now for 5 years. And over the last 5 years, we've supported cities, counties, and special districts, and also civic organizations with, all told, about $300,000 in grants. And so that really gives us the ability every year to put out kind of a pot of money and say, if your project conforms to these criteria, we will try to support you in a specific way, consultatively or through training or through some sort of financial arrangement. So that's when those projects come to us. The other source is we do a lot of training around the state and now around the country of public sector officials in how to do effective public processes. And so we find people that have gone through the training will then call us back up after the training to say, okay, we have a better sense now of what's possible. Will you support either through the grant program or through consultation a project that we're looking to get off the ground here? And in most cases, these are budgets, land use, public safety, water policy. But it's really been either through the training or the grant program that we find people coming to us. What we've found is you need to develop, especially in a state the size of California, you need to develop relationships and what I would call anchors throughout the state. So our advisory council, as I mentioned before, is made up of all public sector officials. And what we do every year at the beginning of the year is we ask them to host a training in their city or region. And we find when you have those local anchors willing to host a training, there are a lot of people in that region that will respect and know that city manager or mayor. And so if there's going to be a training around public engagement in that region, instead of the Davenport Institute coming from above and saying you ought to attend this, when you have someone there more locally who's known and respected inviting you to a training, we found that to be a great model for delivering training. I think it's important to understand that fear is a significant factor in the reason why most public sector officials are reticent about engaging the public. And I think that fear, we have learned, is well-founded because they have engaged the public through a process that's usually been one of these 3-minute at a microphone rant-a-thons, I call them. And if that's your total picture of what public engagement can be, then it's completely understandable that when somebody like the Davenport Institute comes to you and says that there may be a different way of engaging the public, you would be nervous about it. And so what we try to do, and we found this to have a lot of resonance with the public sector officials we engage, is to say that your council and committee meetings are really the community business meeting. And even though you have something called public comment, that really isn't public engagement. And through looking at other methodologies and ways of engaging your residents in a parallel process, we find that your actual council and committee meetings will run much more smoothly. That engaging them in a process that's dialogic outside of the council meeting, you find that you're much less, there's a much lower possibility of having 4 and 5 hour council meetings that are just running through these 3-minute on a microphone diatribes. Yes, the understanding on the part of public sector officials, and I think it's important to bifurcate that you're looking both at staff, administrative public sector officials, as well as electeds. And the reason I think that bifurcation is important is that they both see public engagement in different ways. Is that, yeah, there's a certain feeling of expertise and well-founded expertise on the part of public sector officials saying that I was trained to do this work, I really have the right answers, it's the way to get things done. And an elected official would say, well, I've been elected to make these decisions, why would I then want to engage the public? Both of those points are completely understandable and right. What we found is that in most communities, there are usually 1 or 2 decisions, 1 or 2 policies that have been hanging around for years without any resolution. And the usual ways of making those decisions, either through council or through your staff, have not resulted in a positive step forward on whatever this policy is. And so what we propose is in those instances, not to be used on every issue, but in those 1 or 2 issues that most communities have that you've tried to solve it in the usual way from City Hall out, that maybe there's a more collaborative, participatory way to do that. And so offering them the opportunity to utilize what we would call a different tool in the leadership toolkit to engage the public in a legitimate way that, again, is not a 3-minute at a microphone scenario, is a concept that really does resonate with most public sector officials. I think there really does need to be an issue that is at a place where the public sector officials involved, whether electeds and staff, really can, what we call in our training, take their hands off the wheel of the result of a process. And usually, and unfortunately, that happens when there's a fair amount of exhaustion on the part of City Hall or a county administrative building when they're dealing with an issue. So many of the projects that we consult on and a lot of the folks that we train, when they're considering a public process, it's only been after years of it trying to address an issue in a certain way and it just hasn't gotten solved. Maybe you tried to address it from City Hall and it's gone to the courts or it's gone to the ballot box. I mean, there are a lot of different ways to solve public problems, but there's still these fractured relationships. And so we do find that it's only when you hit a point of exhaustion on a lot of these issues where public sector officials will be willing to sit down and say, you know what, I'm not getting my way, these people aren't getting their way. Is there some sort of collaboration that can happen here to at least deliver a solution? We find that it's most helpful that instead of offering or proposing a specific methodology, that you offer a series of diagnostic questions that a public sector official can ask of themselves and of their staff to determine whether, A, whether they're really ready to engage the public. Are you really ready to hear from them? And a related question is, what are you going to do with the input from a public process? As simple as that sounds, we've seen so many public processes fall apart when a public has been engaged and nobody from the City Hall perspective has actually been ready to do anything with the input. But then related to that, if you are ready, at what level are you ready to engage them? And one of the phrases that we use so often in our training is that your purpose determines your process. Now that process can vary. It can be using online tools, it can be using facilitators, it can be using a mixture of them. But we found that especially at the local level, when there aren't significant budgets to do just straight public engagement, that if you can have the city officials take ownership of the process and do what's best for them in their community. After answering these important questions, they will customize their own process. And they're going to have similar elements, right? They're going to be inclusive and participatory. You're going to offer different sides to make their case kind of in a quasi-jury situation. And you're going to really consider at the front end what you're going to do with the feedback. We suggest oftentimes that you should start with an advisory group made up of both public and private sector leaders just to the process. But again, what comes out of that from a methodology perspective, we're very, I would say, agnostic on methodology. Within that framework, yes. So if we are in a place, and we've certainly been in some relationships where we're talking with a city manager or mayor, and we get to the place where you say, well, what are the options that you would like the public to consider? And you find out that there aren't options, right? That they say, well, we want to go straight to parcel tax, or we're going to have to go this way on this general plan. Well, then it's important that you take a step back and say, then this is not going to be something, don't call this a town hall meeting, right? Don't give this the air or the rhetoric around something that is really engaging of the public when it's not. You've really made up your mind of what direction you want to go, and that can be fine, but don't go through the motions of inviting the public when they think their input is going to be used when it's really not possible. So we think trying to hold public sector officials accountable to what their purposes are in engaging the public is really our first and primary goal. At the beginning of a lot of public processes that we have consulted on, we will hear a mayor or a city manager across the table say, Pete, I need to get cover on this decision. I don't think the public knows how bad this budget situation is or this environmentally related situation is, and we need to get some public cover on making this decision. And what I always say in response to that, whether it's at a training or in a consultation, is that can be the beginning of a great public process that's very participatory, inclusive, where the public's input is really considered, or it can be the beginning of a total disaster, where the public feels that they've been brought into something to hear from them when it's really been an outbound one-way dialogue as opposed to really something that's back and forth. So to your point, yes, I really do believe that there are some public sector officials that see this as a chance to, what I would say, or they would say, the public just needs to feel heard. That's what we call one of our red flag phrases. In some cases, that is true. But in a growing number of cases, it's not just about the public feeling heard. It's really about trying to do something with the wisdom that's there, that they're bringing to the table. And again, I think what the challenge is, from whatever perspective you're bringing to a public process, it's understanding the irony of so many of the public processes that we see at the local level. And that major irony is the processes that we use to engage the public are usually the least engaging of the public. Right? So the 3 minutes at a microphone is something that may be legislatively ordained, that you have to do that, you have to have public comment. But oftentimes what's called public comment is really not a learning experience for either the public or for the public sector official. A lot of times, especially around these budget issues, a resident of the public will come to one of these meetings, especially if it's 3 minutes at the microphone, and they will have the one single answer that they think will solve this problem. And unless you're invited into a discussion that A, you can learn a little bit more, for example, around a budget, and B, the competing elements to why we're in this state, you're not in a place where you can really bounce off your ideas with someone else. And the public sector official doesn't get a sense of the community's willingness to raise taxes, to cut services, to prioritize what those services are, unless you're invited into a discussion that really forces you to make tough choices, like we ask our public sector officials to do all the time. Our goal really at the Davenport Institute, part of our main mission is to say that there are different ways of engaging the public where you can get the wisdom of that room. You can get the local knowledge that's present. You can get people to show up that are finance directors working in the private sector that might give you information that you never considered, or scientists, or planners, or architects. And so that really is our mission. One of the real important factors for participants is that they understand that their participation isn't just going to a report. It's going to be considered by policymakers in a way that can influence their decision. We have found that when the public is invited into a process to really learn through the issues, they will make wise decisions. And not only that, they will provide creative solutions to problems that maybe City Hall has never considered. And we find that when that happens, that you have an opportunity to build community and make much more sustainable decisions. I'm actually very positive about the trajectory of at least local governments understanding the importance of public engagement and public processes. Just in the last year, what you see, a lot of these local government conferences are centered around how can we better engage our residents. I'm almost beginning to think it's a fad. It's getting to that point when you're speaking at conferences and engaging local government officials from around the country. This whole discussion of the changing relationship between City Hall or the county, special districts, and the residents, I really do believe is fundamentally changing. It's changing because of the fiscal crisis, which is ongoing and is not going to stop. And it's changing because of residents and citizens have a much greater power to communicate with one another through the internet and organize through that mechanism. And so you're finding a lot of public sector officials that have been very used to making decisions in City Hall, removed from public engagement, having to be much more proactive in how they engage their residents, whether that's online or in some sort of face-to-face process. So at least at the local level, and I would agree with you, it's still a small percentage and still far below majority, but I really am seeing a trajectory of acceptance and a curiosity on the part of public sector officials in how can we better do this. Now, to the question of how would I envision a better public, I am still very skeptical of larger state and national level public engagement processes. So I'll just put out, that's my bias on that. But I have seen and continue to see these public processes be very effective at the local level. Earlier this year, I was consulting on a project with the city of Bell, who some folks may know it has become the poster child for municipal corruption. You had public sector officials that at least have been accused of stealing money from the public coffers. A new city staff has come in, an entirely new city council has come in, and one of the first steps that they took is to say that we want to engage our residents in a public budgeting process.
This is an historic event for the city of Bell. This is the first time that the community has any input in this kind of discussion where they have an input with the budget. This is what we want, a good, ethical, transparent government. Ethical government is what is really needed in the whole state, not only in the city of Bell.
Now, this is a very low level of engagement, but to go from where that city was 2 years ago, where residents were calling the City Hall, they had nicknamed City Hall the Kremlin, to a place where they're really being very proactive from the City Hall out and saying, we really want to hear from you, we want you to trust the decisions that we're making, we want you to have input in the decisions that we're making, I think shows that if public processes can work in a city like Bell, they can work anywhere. So I'm still very encouraged about what can happen at the local level.